In the developed photo, the children were screaming, but no one could hear them. Mrs. Catherine Wells had been organizing school photo days for 15 years, and she prided herself on making them run smoothly. Today felt different, though. There was an unusual tension in the air that made her constantly check her watch, as if time itself was moving wrong. Lincoln Elementary's annual school photo was always a big event. Parents sent their children in their best clothes, teachers spent extra time making sure everyone looked presentable, and the whole school buzzed with excitement. This year, they'd hired a new photography company, Eternal Memories Photography, after their usual photographer had mysteriously canceled at the last minute. The photographer, who introduced himself only as Mr. Vincent, arrived early that morning in a black van with no company logos or contact information visible anywhere. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the palest blue eyes Mrs. Wells had ever seen. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth seemed too white, too perfect, like porcelain. "Beautiful morning for capturing memories," he said as he unloaded his equipment. His camera was unlike anything Mrs. Wells had seen before, an enormous, old-fashioned device that looked more like something from the 1940s than modern equipment. The flash attachment was particularly impressive, almost cathedral-like in its ornate design. "Will that old camera take good pictures?" Mrs. Wells asked, concerned about the quality parents would expect. Mr. Vincent's pale eyes sparkled with amusement. "Oh, Mrs. Wells, this camera takes the most permanent photographs you'll ever see. The children will be preserved forever." Something about the way he said preserved made her skin crawl, but she dismissed it as nerves. She'd been working too many late nights lately, grading papers and preparing lesson plans. By 9 a.m., the gymnasium had been transformed into a photography studio. Black backdrops hung from portable stands, professional lighting equipment cast dramatic shadows across the room, and Mr. Vincent's antique camera sat on its heavy tripod like a mechanical predator waiting to strike. The first class to be photographed was Mrs. Rodriguez's third-grade class, 16 bright-eyed 8-year-olds who couldn't stop giggling and whispering to each other. They lined up in 2 rows as Mrs. Wells had instructed, shorter children sitting cross-legged in front, taller ones standing behind. "Perfect, perfect," Mr. Vincent murmured, adjusting his camera settings with practiced precision. "Everyone look right here at the camera. Think about your happiest memory." The children's faces brightened as they thought about birthdays, holidays, family pets, and summer vacations. Mrs. Wells stood off to the side, smiling at how perfectly behaved they were being. Sometimes photo day could be a nightmare of fidgeting and silly faces. On the count of 3, Mr. Vincent announced, his finger hovering over what looked like an old-fashioned flash trigger. 1, 2, 3. The flash wasn't like any camera flash Mrs. Wells had ever seen. Instead of the brief, bright pop of modern equipment, this flash seemed to explode outward like lightning, filling the entire gymnasium with blinding white light that lasted for what felt like several seconds. The light was so intense it left after images dancing behind her closed eyelids. When the light finally faded and Mrs. Wells could see again, she blinked in confusion. The camera was still there. Mr. Vincent was still there, already preparing for the next shot. But the children. What Mrs. Wells saw next would make her question everything she thought she knew about photography. The 16 children were still in their exact positions, sitting cross-legged, standing in perfect rows, smiling their brightest smiles. But something was fundamentally wrong. They weren't moving. Not even blinking. They sat and stood like mannequins, frozen in that perfect moment of happiness. "Children?" Mrs. Wells called out hesitantly. "You can relax now. The picture's been taken." No response. Not even the slightest twitch. She walked closer, her footsteps echoing strangely in the gymnasium. Up close, she could see that the children's eyes were open but glassy, unfocused. Their skin had taken on a waxy, artificial quality, like the figures in a high-end department store window. "Mr. Vincent," she said, her voice rising with panic, "what's wrong with them?" The photographer was calmly packing away his flash equipment. "Wrong? Nothing's wrong, Mrs. Wells. They're perfect. Absolutely perfect." captured at their happiest moment, preserved for all eternity. They're not moving. Of course not. How can they move? They're in the photograph now. Mrs. Wells stared at him, trying to process his words. That's impossible. People don't just disappear into photographs. Mr. Vincent smiled that porcelain smile. Don't they? Haven't you ever looked at an old family photo and felt like the people in it were more real than the world around you? Haven't you ever wished you could step into a photograph and live in that perfect moment forever? She looked back at the frozen children. Tommy Martinez, who had been so excited about picture day that he'd gotten up an hour early to perfect his hair. Lucy Chen, who had worn her grandmother's pearl necklace for the first time. David Thompson, who usually hated having his picture taken but had been genuinely smiling today. All of them perfectly still. Perfectly preserved. Perfectly trapped. Bring them back, she whispered. Back? But why would they want to come back? Look at them, Mrs. Wells. They're happy. They'll be happy forever. No more homework, no more tests, no more growing up and facing the disappointments of adulthood. They're 8 years old forever, in the most perfect moment of their lives. But Mrs. Wells was about to discover something even more terrifying about Mr. Vincent's special photography. As she stared at the motionless children, Mrs. Wells noticed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Their shadows were moving. While the children themselves remained perfectly still, their shadows on the gymnasium floor were writhing, reaching out, trying to escape from their frozen owners. Their shadows. She breathed. Ah, yes, Mr. Vincent said, following her gaze. The shadows always try to escape first. Don't worry about them. They'll settle down eventually. They always do. How many times have you done this? Oh, Mrs. Wells, I've been preserving children's perfect moments for longer than you might imagine. Decades. Centuries, even. Time works differently when you're in the business of capturing eternity. He gestured toward his camera, and for the first time, Mrs. Wells noticed something that made her stomach lurch. The camera wasn't just old-fashioned, it was covered in what looked like photographs. Hundreds of tiny photographs layered over every surface of the device like scales on some prehistoric creature. And in each photograph, she could see faces. Children's faces. All of them smiling, all of them perfectly preserved, all of them screaming. The camera collects them, Mr. Vincent explained, seeing her horrified expression. Each perfect moment becomes part of the next perfect moment. They're all connected now, all living in their eternal happiness. Mrs. Wells tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. She looked down and gasped. Her shadow, too, was beginning to stretch and writhe on the gymnasium floor. Oh, don't worry about yourself just yet, Mr. Vincent said kindly. You're not scheduled to be photographed until the end of the day. Faculty photos, remember? But first, we have 15 more classes to work through. 15 more perfect moments to preserve. As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the gymnasium doorway with her second-grade class 18 7-year-olds chattering excitedly about having their picture taken. Are you ready for us, Mr. Vincent? Mrs. Patterson called out cheerfully. More than ready, he replied, adjusting his camera settings. Please have the children line up in the usual formation. Mrs. Wells tried to shout a warning, but no sound came from her throat. She could only watch in horror as Mrs. Patterson arranged her students in 2 perfect rows, their young faces glowing with anticipation. What happened during the second photograph would reveal the true horror of Mr. Vincent's collection. This time, Mrs. Wells forced herself to watch carefully as Mr. Vincent prepared a shot. She noticed details she'd missed before. The way his fingers moved over the camera weren't just adjusting settings, but seemed to be caressing the trapped faces embedded in its surface. The way his pale blue eyes reflected the children's images even before he took the photograph. And most disturbing of all, the way the children in the first photograph, the ones who were supposedly frozen forever, seemed to be turning their heads ever so slightly to watch the second group. Beautiful, children. Think of your happiest memory. Mr. Vincent called out. But this time, Mrs. Wells heard something else in his voice. A hunger. An anticipation that had nothing to do with professional photography and everything to do with a predator about to feed. 1, 2, 3. Again, the impossible flash filled the gymnasium. Again, the blinding white light that seemed to last forever. But this time, Mrs. Wells kept her eyes open despite the pain, determined to see exactly what was happening to the children. In the midst of the flash, she saw them. Not the children being photographed, but the others, the ones already trapped in the camera. They were there in the light, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Children from different eras, wearing clothes from different decades, all reaching out toward the new arrivals with expressions of desperate longing. And when the light faded, Mrs. Patterson's 18 students had joined Mrs. Rodriguez's 16 in their eternal frozen tableau. 34 children now stood or sat in perfect stillness, their shadows the only part of them still fighting for freedom. But Mrs. Patterson was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" Mrs. Wells managed to croak. Mr. Vincent was examining his camera with satisfaction, running his fingers over a new photograph that had appeared on its surface, a picture of Mrs. Patterson, mouth open in mid-scream, eyes wide with terror. "Teachers are special," he said conversationally. "Children preserve better when their authority figures are watching over them. She's keeping an eye on her students, even now." Mrs. Wells looked more carefully at the camera and felt her sanity beginning to crack. The photographs covering its surface weren't random, they were organized. Classes of children clustered around tiny images of their teachers, all of them perfectly preserved in their moments of greatest fear or happiness. "How long have you been doing this?" she whispered. "Time is irrelevant when you're creating art, Mrs. Wells. But if you must know, I began my work in 1847, with a small schoolhouse in Vermont. 23 children and their teacher, captured during their Christmas pageant. They're still there, you know, still performing their little play over and over again in perfect happiness." But Mr. Vincent was about to reveal something that would change Mrs. Wells' understanding of everything. He turned the camera slightly, showing her its side panel, and Mrs. Wells saw something that made her knees buckle. Carved into the wooden surface were names and dates, hundreds of them, stretching back over a century and a half. School names, teacher names, numbers of children preserved. Lincoln Elementary, October 15, 2024, she read aloud from the most recent entry, 347 children, 23 teachers. "Not quite complete yet," Mr. Vincent said, pulling out an ornate pocket watch. "We still have 13 more classes to photograph, plus the faculty picture at the end of the day. Then Lincoln Elementary will join my permanent collection." 347 children, Mrs. Wells repeated numbly. The entire school. Every soul in the building, actually. I've found that incomplete collections tend to be unstable. The preserved subjects become restless when they know their friends and colleagues are still in the outside world. Much better to keep everyone together. As he spoke, more teachers began arriving with their classes. Mrs. Williams with her kindergartners, Mr. Johnson with his fifth graders, Ms. Garcia with her special education students. All of them smiling, all of them unsuspecting, all of them leading their precious charges toward eternal preservation. Mrs. Wells watched in growing horror as each class was photographed and frozen. The gymnasium filled with motionless children and vanishing teachers, their shadows creating an increasingly chaotic dance on the floor as more and more souls were trapped in Mr. Vincent's hellish camera. With each flash, the camera seemed to grow more elaborate, more photographs appearing on its surface, more faces joining the collection. And with each new addition, Mrs. Wells could swear she heard something, a sound like distant screaming, muffled and far away, coming from inside the camera itself. But it wasn't until the 7th class photo that Mrs. Wells discovered the most terrifying truth of all. When Mr. Vincent photographed Mrs. Anderson's 4th grade class, one of the children, a boy named Michael Porter, didn't freeze completely. His body remained motionless like the others, but his eyes continued to move, darting frantically back and forth, filled with awareness and absolute terror. "He's still conscious," Mrs. Wells gasped. "Of course he is," Mr. Vincent replied matter-of-factly. "They all are." That's what makes the preservation so perfect. Their bodies are frozen in their happiest moment, but their minds remain active. They can see, they can hear, they can think, they just can't move or speak. Perfect preservation requires perfect awareness. Mrs. Wells stared at the rows of frozen children with new horror. All those glassy eyes she thought were empty, they weren't empty at all. Behind each pair of unblinking eyes was a terrified child, trapped in their own body, aware of everything happening around them but powerless to do anything about it. "You monster," she whispered. "Artist," Mr. Vincent corrected. "I'm an artist creating the ultimate art form, living sculptures that will never age, never change, never disappoint anyone. These children will remain perfect forever." He began setting up for the 8th class photo, and Mrs. Wells realized with growing desperation that she was running out of time. More than half the school had already been processed. Soon it would be her turn, and then there would be no one left to stop him from completing his collection. But as she looked around the gymnasium at the growing crowd of frozen children, she noticed something that gave her the first spark of hope she'd felt all day. The shadows on the floor weren't just writhing randomly, they were trying to communicate. The shadows of the trapped children were moving in patterns, spelling out words, reaching towards specific objects. Mrs. Wells followed one shadow's pointing gesture and saw it was indicating Mr. Vincent's equipment bag. Moving as casually as she could, she edged toward the bag while Mr. Vincent was busy arranging the next class for their photo. Inside, she found not just photographic supplies but something much more interesting, dozens of photographs, but these were different from the ones embedded in the camera. These photos showed children and teachers, but they were moving, gesturing, clearly alive despite being trapped in two-dimensional form. At the bottom of the bag was a leather-bound journal filled with Mr. Vincent's handwriting. She flipped through it quickly, her heart racing as she read entries describing his work over the decades. But it was the final entry that made her blood run cold. "The collection grows stronger with each acquisition. When Lincoln Elementary is complete, I will have enough trapped souls to attempt the Great Convergence. All preserved subjects will be released from their individual photographs and merged into a single, perfect reality where I will rule as the eternal photographer, capturing moments for all eternity." But Mrs. Wells was about to discover something in the journal that could save everyone if she could survive long enough to use it. On the very last page of the journal, written in different handwriting, shakier, more desperate, was a note. "If you're reading this, you've found Vincent's weakness. The camera must complete its cycle. All subjects in one location must be photographed before the preservation becomes permanent. If the cycle is interrupted, if even one intended subject escapes, the entire collection becomes unstable. The photographs will shatter, releasing everyone. But be warned, the photographer will not survive the reversal." Maria Santos, teacher, St. Agnes Elementary, 1962-inch. Mrs. Wells looked up from the journal to see Mr. Vincent finishing with the 10th class. Only a few more groups remained, plus the faculty photo at the end. She was running out of time. But now she knew what she had to do. She had to make sure she wasn't in that faculty photo. She had to escape before the collection was complete, and somehow find a way to shatter the cycle from the outside. The problem was, Mr. Vincent was watching her now. His pale blue eyes had fixed on her with laser focus, and that porcelain smile had taken on a predatory edge. "Getting close to your turn, Mrs. Wells," he said as he set up for the 11th class photo. "I do hope you'll cooperate. It would be such a shame if our final faculty photo wasn't absolutely perfect." What Mrs. Wells did next would either save 300 children or doom them all to eternal imprisonment. She looked around the gymnasium one more time. Hundreds of frozen children now filled the space, their shadows creating a writhing carpet of desperate movement on the floor. The teachers' faces stared out from the camera's surface, eternally screaming in their two-dimensional prison. Mrs. Wells made her decision. "Actually, Mr. Vincent," she said, standing up straighter and putting on her best administrative voice, "I just remembered I have an important phone call to make. I'll be back in time for the faculty photo, don't worry." She started walking toward the gymnasium exit, fighting every instinct that told her to run. "Mrs. Wells," Mr. Vincent's voice carried a note of warning. "I really think you should stay. The collection works best when it's complete. Just 5 minutes, she called over her shoulder, still walking at a measured pace. Surely 5 minutes won't hurt. She was almost to the door when she heard the mechanical whirring of the camera being repositioned. She glanced back and saw Mr. Vincent turning the massive device toward her, his finger hovering over the flash trigger. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," he said, his smile vanishing completely. "You see, Mrs. Wells, you were never meant to leave this gymnasium alive. The faculty photo was just going to be a bonus. The truth is, you've been part of my collection since the moment you stepped into this room." The flash began to build, that impossible white light gathering in the ornate fixture like captured lightning. Mrs. Wells ran. The final flash would either trap her forever or destroy everything Mr. Vincent had built over 177 years. She burst through the gymnasium doors just as the flash exploded behind her, the white light so intense it turned the hallway windows into blazing rectangles of brilliance. But she wasn't frozen. She wasn't trapped. She was still moving, still free. Behind her, she heard Mr. Vincent's voice rise to an inhuman shriek of rage and fear. The building began to shake. Not an earthquake, something else. Something that came from the gymnasium, spreading outward through the walls and floors like cracks in reality itself. Mrs. Wells ran down the empty hallway toward the main office, passing classroom after classroom of empty desks and chairs. The entire school had been in that gymnasium. Every student, every teacher, every staff member except her. She reached the main office and grabbed the emergency phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. But before she could speak, the building shook again, harder this time, and she heard a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The sound of hundreds of photographs shattering at once. The sound of trapped souls breaking free. The sound of children's voices, raised not in screams but in cheers of joy and relief. She ran back toward the gymnasium, her heart pounding with desperate hope. As she reached the doors, they burst open and children began pouring out, real children, moving children, laughing and crying and very much alive. "Mrs. Wells." Tommy Martinez ran up to her, tears streaming down his face. "We could see everything. We could hear everything. But we couldn't move." "I know, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I know. But you're safe now. You're all safe." More children flooded out of the gymnasium, followed by the teachers who had vanished during their classes' photo sessions. Everyone was accounted for, everyone was alive, everyone was free. All except Mr. Vincent. Mrs. Wells looked into the gymnasium one last time and saw him standing beside his camera, which was now nothing more than twisted metal and broken glass. Thousands of shattered photographs littered the floor around him like confetti made of memories. But he wasn't angry anymore. He was fading. Becoming translucent, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. 177 years, he said, his voice now barely a whisper. 177 years of perfect moments, and you've destroyed them all. "They weren't perfect," Mrs. Wells replied firmly. "They were prisons." Mr. Vincent looked down at his hands, which were now so transparent she could see through them to the gymnasium floor. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I had forgotten what true happiness looked like." He raised his eyes to meet hers one last time, and for just a moment, his pale blue eyes looked almost human. "Tell them," he began, then stopped. "No. Let them forget. Let them all forget this ever happened. Let them have their real perfect moments." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the twisted remains of his camera and the echo of centuries' worth of trapped memories finally set free. But as the children celebrated their freedom, Mrs. Wells noticed something that would change everything she thought she understood about the day's events. As she helped organize the confused children and teachers, making sure everyone was accounted for and unharmed, Mrs. Wells picked up one of the thousands of photograph fragments scattered across the gymnasium floor. It was a picture of her. Not from today, this photograph was old, faded, from decades ago. She was wearing a school uniform she recognized from her own childhood, standing with a class of children in front of a camera she now knew all too well. At the bottom of the photograph fragment, in careful handwriting that she recognized as her own from 40 years ago, were the words, "Lincoln Elementary School, 3rd grade, Mrs. Wells class, October 15, 1984. She stared at the photograph with growing horror and understanding. She had been here before. She had been one of Mr. Vincent's victims, trapped for 40 years in his collection until today's disruption had freed not just the current students, but everyone he had ever captured. She looked around at the celebrating children and teachers with new eyes. How many of them were from different decades? How many of them had been living the same day over and over again, preserved in Mr. Vincent's twisted idea of perfection? And if that was true, if she had been trapped for 40 years without aging, without changing, without even remembering her imprisonment, what year was it really? Mrs. Wells pulled out her phone to check the date, but the screen showed something impossible. October 15, 1984. The same date as the photograph fragment in her hand. The same date as her first encounter with Mr. Vincent's camera. The same date that had been repeating for 40 years, with each cycle adding new victims to the collection until she finally found a way to break the pattern. But if the pattern was truly broken, if the cycle was finally ended, why was her phone still showing 1984? She looked up from the phone to see the children and teachers beginning to fade around her, becoming translucent like Mr. Vincent had just before he disappeared. The gymnasium itself was starting to blur at the edges, reality becoming unstable. "Mrs. Wells," Tommy Martinez said, his young voice distant and echoing, "are we going home now?" She looked down at the boy who was slowly becoming transparent, then at the photograph fragment in her hand that showed her own young face from 40 years ago. "I don't know, Tommy," she whispered. "I honestly don't know where home is anymore." The last thing she saw before everything faded to white was Mr. Vincent's camera, somehow whole again despite being shattered moments before, its lens reflecting an image she couldn't quite make out but that filled her with a familiar dread. And in the distance, growing louder by the second, she could hear the sound of a school bell ringing, calling children to their classes on what she was beginning to suspect would be October 15, 1984. Again.